story of Spartacus is epic in every way. The gladiator who led a slave army to challenge the might of Rome. Even his admirers are larger than life. Karl Marx called him the most splendid fellow in ancient history. For Kirk Douglas, he was a slave dreaming of the death of slavery. The Spartacus legend has a powerful popular appeal, as cinema quickly spotted. It celebrates the courage of the individual struggling against overwhelming odds.
Your lives are to be spared on the single condition that you identify the slave called Spartacus.
Suddenly, every man got a new identity and a new name.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
But behind the myth was a real man.
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
A slave-turned gladiator who almost changed history. How can we separate the man from the legend? Even for the experts, it can be difficult.
I am Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
I am Spartacus.
And I'm Spartacus.
Mark Corby is an authority on Roman military history and a former professional soldier. His time in military intelligence means he has a particular interest in discovering how a simple gladiator could defeat the legions of Rome.
What intrigues me about Spartacus is how this man of lowly origin managed to more than hold his own for nearly 2 years against the might of the greatest empire of the ancient world. Yet this figure remains extraordinarily enigmatic, and I hope to put some flesh on otherwise very bare bones.
Spartacus lived in the century before Christ. Our slender knowledge of him comes from Roman writings, but they're concerned with his rebellion, not his personal history. They simply say he came from Thrace, present-day Bulgaria. He was a barbarian and a slave. Slavery was the lifeblood that enabled Rome to build its empire. Already in the 1st century BC, the city dominated the Mediterranean world. It had brought 2 million slaves like Spartacus to Italy, almost 1 in 3 of the population. They came from conquered nations to feed the Roman war machine and support the lavish lifestyle of Roman citizens. In the heart of present-day Rome, Mark Corby was shown evidence of just how much the Romans depended on slaves in the time of Spartacus.
Well, come along through here then, Mark. Behind this gate is one of the most extraordinary things in Rome, a wonderful survival, house of the 1st century BC.
Right, yes. Now this is contemporary with Spartacus, is it not?
It's not far off, about 70s BC, maybe a bit later. And it's supposed to be the house of a great Roman aristocrat, Aemilius Scaurus. And he's got one of the best positions in Rome. Do you see through the window out there? And this would be the grand entrance.
Aemilius Scaurus was a wealthy merchant and builder of Rome's first amphitheatre.
Yes, so absolutely at the top.
But look down here, and you've got a complete contrast. This is how the other half lives.
Below the house, the slave quarters show what underpinned Roman privilege 2,000 years ago.
Look round here to the left, Mark. You see just a tiny little cubicle, just room for the bed itself and about a couple of feet in which to get onto the bed.
No light whatsoever.
And there's that low ceiling again up there.
For every household of wealthy citizens, there was a warren of these dark dungeons. Up to 400 slaves in tightly packed anonymity.
How many people do you think Scaurus could actually keep down here?
You really can't fit more than one, most 2 in each room, and yet there were households that had hundreds of slaves.
Up to what? 200 or 300, perhaps?
400.
Oh, yes, the famous case.
Even when restored, the tiny cells reflect the confined lives of the slaves who lived here.
If you come through here, you've got one which they've actually reconstructed.
Oh, with plaster still there, isn't
Well,
it?
yes, that's genuine ancient plasterwork. And with decoration.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Now, presumably, somebody like Spartacus would think they'd rather arrived in heaven if they were to live in such accommodation
Well,
as this.
I think Spartacus would have been very lucky indeed to be in such well-decorated circumstances. No, this is not a room for a ground-down gladiator.
Yes.
Spartacus would have known that 2 earlier slave revolts on Sicily had both been crushed. They'd unsettled the Romans. Slaves were kept in place now by fear of retribution.
Slavery, by its very nature, is a violent, oppressive system. You can be beaten, you can be crucified, you can be executed, you can be flogged. And it's not so much that this necessarily happened every day, but the fear of it must have pervaded every slave's life and consciousness. I think that slaves were in danger of their lives, or felt themselves to be, and masters were in danger of slaves. So there was a mutual enmity.
For the Romans, slaves were the enemy within, yet their lowly status made them almost invisible. This depiction of a slave at auction is rare. But there was one place they couldn't be disregarded, in the gladiatorial arena. Because the men who fought and died in this most Roman of rituals were, almost without exception, slaves. The Romans saw bloodshed in the arena as a celebration of the highest of virtues. Courage in the face of death. Its origins were lost in antiquity as a funeral rite to honor great men. But while they prized gladiatorial combat, the Romans despised gladiators. In law, they were treated as equivalent to criminals and prostitutes.
The gladiator in the ancient world had a very curious status. He could be idolized by the Roman spectators in the arena. But he was also the lowest of the low. He was infamous. He had no citizen status. He was a criminal. He was lower than human. And his fighting in the arena was his punishment played out for the pleasure of the Roman audience.
So how did Spartacus become a gladiator? We're told he was renowned for strength and daring. In Thrace, he'd fought the Roman invaders so bravely that they'd employed him as a mercenary. Sold as a slave, he became perfect fodder for the arena. He was taken not to Rome, but 120 miles south, down the Appian Way to the city of Capua. Today, it's a traffic-choked provincial town. But 2,000 years ago, this was the center of gladiatorial excellence for the Roman Empire. In the shadow of the later amphitheater, Mark Corby found the remains of the training ground where Spartacus was blooded as a gladiator.
Capua is the most important gladiatorial site in the Roman world. This was the absolute center of the sport, the Old Trafford of the sport by our standards. The audiences here would have been more perceptive than audiences anywhere else in Italy, and the combat was also matchless. This was a society that loved blood, and the killing was absolutely central to its culture. This was a way of demonstrating to the audience in that arena behind me, life and death, pathos, skill at arms, brutality, the whole works.
What offense Spartacus committed to be made a slave, we don't know. We're simply told he was bought at auction by a shadowy figure called Lentulus Batiatus, a lanista, or trainer of gladiators here in Capua. For him, Spartacus would have been just another fighter from the fringes of the empire.
Most of the gladiators would probably be only recently enslaved. They were brought to Italy, they were put up stark naked in the slave market. A lanista would come along and look at them and say, he's got just the body to make a good gladiator. So this would have been a bit of a shock. One minute they will have been living in a small mud hut on the other side of the Rhine, perhaps, or in the depths of Macedonia, and a year later they'd be fighting for their lives in the arena behind me.
It was a nightmare world they were entering, and new gladiators had to submit to it unconditionally.
Gladiators undertook an oath that they would do as they were told or run the risk of being beaten or branded or even killed. So it was an extraordinarily tough regime filled with threats, violence, and arbitrary acts of cruelty.
In this brutal setting, organized resistance was almost impossible. Thracians, Gauls, and Germans were separated by language and culture. Their training divided them still further, setting man against man.
You would not want to befriend a fellow gladiator if you knew you were going to have to face them in the arena the next day, if you knew that to live they had to die. And yet, the history of Spartacus and his breaking out of the Capua school with his fellow gladiators suggests that somewhere along the line, Spartacus managed to overcome that terrible problem of the gladiatorial school and to find a common bond.
When the opportunity arrived, it was sudden. Spartacus persuaded over 70 fellow gladiators to make the bid for freedom with makeshift weapons.
Spartacus and about 74 companions broke out of his gladiatorial barracks. Now that happened almost exactly where I'm sitting now, maybe a few yards. We don't know the precise spot, but it was in a few meters of where I'm sitting. Using their initiative, they went straight to the cookhouse, grabbed as many cleavers and spits and other nasty-looking domestic instruments, and used those initially as weapons. The moment came, they saw their chance, overpowered the guards, and so started the Great Revolt.
After breaking out from their training barracks in Capua, Spartacus and his gladiators took refuge on Mount Vesuvius. Below them was Pompeii, the soft underbelly of the Roman world, a city notorious for its self-indulgence. Even the gladiator barracks in Pompeii were highly decorated. Its citizens were enthusiastic spectators of bloodshed in the arena. Spartacus himself may well have fought in this amphitheater. It was a major venue for fighters trained in Capua. But now he was the spectator. And from his vantage point on the mountain, Spartacus threatened to make Pompeii his entertainment.
This really was one of the softest cities in Italy. It had gloried in gladiatorial games, it promoted gladiatorial games, and suddenly the gladiators were after them.
the gladiators were not alone. Their camp on Vesuvius had become a beacon, attracting all those who had a grievance against Rome. Its social outcasts had long been bitter. Now, in Spartacus, they had found a figurehead.
Spartacus seems to accumulate a very mixed group of people. You've got a core of gladiators, then you've got runaway slaves. But you've then got the whole sort of rather unstable population of the area, the dispossessed, anyone who hasn't got a firm stake in the land gathers around the banners.
The numbers were swelling, but it was a motley band of runaways gathered in the rebel camp. The troops sent to quell the uprising can have had little foreboding.
When the first Roman force of 3,000 men arrived at Vesuvius, they will have been very cocky and overconfident. Here they were, just taking on a small handful of gladiators, as they saw it, and some miscellaneous scum. After all, they represented the great power. They had leadership, they had weapons, they had equipment, they had the greatest state in the known world behind them. Frankly, this was going to be a bit of a pushover.
Spartacus was determined to prove otherwise. The Romans might have superior force, but he had a gladiator's sense of timing. He could afford to wait and watch for an opening.
From up there, of course, he had a magnificent view of the entire Campanian plain. He was sitting really in his own natural amphitheatre. He really was in a supreme position to see what was going to happen or judge his enemies' moves.
And when they least expected it, Spartacus struck. Using ropes made from vines, he abseiled his entire force down the steepest face of Vesuvius to encircle the enemy.
He manages to get behind the Roman lines and then attacks their camp from behind. Now, because they're raw troops and they're not expecting this, they panic. I mean, the worst possible thing has happened. One moment they think they have Spartacus bottled up on a 4,000-foot mountain. The next second he's cut them off and he's assaulting their camp. And they obviously issue the famous order, run away.
Spartacus had won the first bout, but the real contest was just beginning. The Roman response to defeat was massive retaliation. A second force was sent, twice the size of the first. It carried before it the symbol of Roman authority, the fasces. This axe, tightly bound in a bundle of rods, represented Rome's power to enforce its laws through beating and execution. For the 6,000 troops marching behind it, this was the equivalent of a mission statement. The rebels were common criminals and to be dispatched accordingly. What followed for the Romans was humiliation. In a brilliant campaign, Spartacus not only destroyed their army, but seized the fasces from them. The power of Rome, or at least its symbol, was now in the hands of the slaves. Spartacus did not let the delights of Pompey detain his troops. He led them south, plundering smaller towns and moving quickly. We're told that he shared the spoils equally with his men, unheard of in a Roman commander. This was a new kind of leader, and he was about to face a new challenge. Here on the coast, in the old Greek colony of Metapontum, he established winter quarters. This is where he would turn slaves into soldiers.
It's a perfect site for Spartacus to have picked, frankly, for the winter. It's over 350 miles from Rome, so it makes it awkward to get to. Its rear is protected by the sea, so you cannot be surrounded and cut off here. The approaches to it over there, once one gets up into the hill country, are fairly awkward. It sits in an incredibly rich plain, just oozing with Weetabix and goodies that the Greeks have been irrigating for 500 years, so there's no problem with food supply. And he's got about 3 to 4 months to turn his polyglot multinational force into a credible fighting army.
What this slave army needed was weapons and armor. To get them, Spartacus impressed hard-headed priorities on his followers.
The sources tell us a very interesting story that a number of traders turn up to do deals with Spartacus's army to trade probably the booty that they have looted. That Spartacus forbids his soldiers to sell booty for gold or silver. He says, all I want is brass or iron, because brass and iron can be turned into weapons, because he's effectively setting up an arms industry here, smelting iron and turning it as fast as possible into whatever armor and equipment he can make, so that every man has a weapon.
And this was the weapon, the Roman gladius, or short sword. It was their ability with the gladius that gave the gladiators their name. Now the task was to pass on that lethal skill at arms to their raw recruits. Spartacus could hammer the slaves into shape as soldiers, but he had a more daunting problem forging together their national identities. From the first breakout, he'd faced dissent from the Gauls, or Celts, and the Germans under their leader, Crixus. These preferred pillage and plunder to marching and fighting. They'd reached an uneasy pact, but Spartacus knew his authority was precarious.
They had no ideology, they had no doctrine, no shared set of principles. So his leadership must always have been slightly tenuous. He's not a general in an institutionalized position. He's a leader who must retain leadership by force of personality, but the separate identity of the Celts Germans persists.
So Spartacus determined to give his slave army an objective in which all could share. They would not wait for the Romans. They would march north, fight their way over the Alps, and go home to freedom. He could lead, but would they follow? The Germans, we are told, were full of insolent self-confidence. They agreed to his plan, but insisted they march separately. They didn't get far. On the slopes of Mount Garganus, the waiting Romans saw their chance. Falling on the German column, they slaughtered 20,000 of them, including their leader, Crixus. It was a savage blow. Yet Spartacus rallied his troops through sheer audacity. Crixus may have been troublesome in life, but in death he'd be given the same honors as a noble Roman. His spirit would be appeased with funeral games and the spilling of blood, Roman blood.
Spartacus bounces back with an extraordinary piece of theatre, a fantastic piece of propaganda. He takes 400 Roman prisoners, who he's previously captured, and forces them to fight gladiatorial games, funereal games, for the very soul of Crixus. Now, this is an extraordinary reverse, and would have caused the Romans extraordinary intake of breath when this news got back to Rome.
It was a defining moment. Spartacus, the slave, had become more Roman than the Romans. From now on, he would be under their skin.
This is the nightmare opponent. He's the lowest of the low, but he's got the brains, he's got the courage that are the defining characteristics of a civilization that sees itself as superior. And he's seizing all their virtues, challenging them, and saying, I, the slave, am the real hero. That's a tremendous psychological challenge.
A slave in an army of slaves is a slave no longer. The rebels were in good order as they followed Spartacus, but ahead lay formidable opposition. Fortune had favored them so far. The Romans were tied up in 3 foreign wars. The troops left at home were not their finest. But after a 500-mile march, the rebels were about to meet an elite. At Mutina, present-day Modena, they would face the battle-hardened army of the northern frontier, under its commander, Gaius Cassius.
This army is the real thing, a real professional Roman battle-trained army with long-service professional centurions as its backbone. Both sides know this is absolutely crucial. This is the battle that really does count.
For Spartacus, the stakes couldn't be higher. 2 full legions, 10,000 men, stood between his rebel army and the Alps. Beyond them lay freedom. This was the ultimate test of all their training with the gladius and of their resolve.
This is close-quarter infantry killing. When I say close quarter, men are killing each other when they're only 24 inches apart, fighting shoulder to shoulder, neck to neck. You can smell the other man's stench of breath. You can smell his cheap wine, the garlic. You can see his stubble on his chin as you ram your sword through the man's throat and rupture his jugular. You will be splashed in his blood.
In a trial of blood, it was the army of the gladiators who triumphed. With single-minded tenacity, they hacked their way through the Roman lines. The army of Gaius Cassius was literally put to the sword.
The Romans are overwhelmed and annihilated. Virtually every man, I think, is lost. Because not only is their army destroyed, but we know that their camp is also taken, and that one source also tells us that their commander, the proconsul, is also killed. This is inexplicable. This is a first-class military victory.
For Spartacus, the way was open across the Alps to lead his followers homewards. This at last was the moment for which they had fought so hard. But incredibly, in the moment of victory, they chose to turn away from freedom. Instead, they marched south once more, back into the lion's mouth. Spartacus and his slave army had fought their way up the length of Italy to the Alps. Ahead lay the prospect of a return to their homelands and to freedom. But Spartacus now found his followers had no desire to go home. They wanted to march south again and go on fighting Romans.
The army have got a taste now for plunder and loot and booty, and the idea of clambering across the Alps and heading into the barbarian world beyond is not very attractive. The men say, right, we're going to vote with our feet. We ain't going forward. We want to go backwards. And however much he harangues them, he can do nothing about it.
But Spartacus too had something to lose.
He must have thought that he would go back to anonymity. He would no longer be a general. The only way in which he could maintain his status, the exhilaration of combat, of being in charge, was to keep his army together.
As Spartacus headed southwards, in Rome there was something close to panic. The slaves had to be planning to attack the capital. No one could be found to lead another army against Spartacus. Fighting slaves brought little honor, being defeated by them still less. One man finally took on the task. He had little experience in war, but was ambitious for high office. Marcus Licinius Crassus had a further distinction. He was the richest man in Rome.
Crassus we mostly see as a businessman or a speculator. He's famous for owning enormous amounts of property in Rome, tearing it down, putting up new houses, and becoming enormously rich. And Crassus is the man who says the definition of wealth is you have to be able to equip an army from your own resources.
Crassus had gold in plenty, but in Roman politics one currency counted above all others: military victory. The slave army would serve his ends.
This is a great opportunity to increase his prestige, his wealth, his gravitas, and everything else that a Roman aristocrat of his background would look to. It looks as if he may have actually paid for the recruiting of 6 legions himself, which is rather like somebody today paying for the recruitment of the Rhine army or something. It is absolutely enormous wealth. So this is Crassus's great chance.
An opportunity for Crassus, a fresh throw of the dice for Spartacus. From this point, their fortunes were locked together.
The gladiator against the general, the slave against the master, the poor against the rich. It's all neatly embodied in Spartacus and Crassus.
Crassus was waiting for his adversary's next move. The defenses of the city were in place. The slave army would be broken on the walls of Rome itself. The attack never came. Spartacus knew the Romans too well to take on their fortifications with no siege equipment. He would stay in open country and make his opponents come to him. They met near Picenum. The new legions of Crassus performed badly and fled. Crassus may have bought himself an army, but it wasn't a good one.
The Romans, frankly, run away. Even worse, they shed their equipment to run even faster. And Crassus now is faced with an appalling problem. He must get a grip soon, otherwise this army will go exactly the same way all the other Roman armies have gone. And to do this, he reverts to a very old and famous Roman punishment of decimation.
Decimation had been the ancient Roman penalty for cowardice. It involved the killing of every 10th man amongst those responsible. In the case of Crassus's army, that could mean up to 4,000 executed. Those picked out were beaten to death by their own comrades. Decimation had not been practiced for generations, but now Crassus was staking his claim to the ancient Roman virtues.
You have to make an example of men who run away. You have to get across to them that Crassus is more terrifying than Spartacus. And this is exactly what getting a grip is all about.
The tide was turning. When the Romans next encountered the slave army, it was the rebels who came off worse. Day by day, the slaves now withdrew further south. But Spartacus was marching with a purpose. His objective was Sicily. The island was the main source of grain for Rome and had its own history of slave unrest. If Spartacus struck here, he could cut off the Romans' food supplies and create a rebel stronghold. But the waters between Sicily and the mainland are treacherous. In mythology, they are home to the sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, testimony to the powerful currents found in the narrow straits. Spartacus had planned to ferry his troops across by striking a deal with pirates, but they betrayed him. Now, with the onset of winter, he and his army found themselves cornered.
When Crassus hears Spartacus is down here, which is the exact point where I am now, right opposite Sicily, he probably rubs his hands with joy, because it looks to him as if Spartacus has walked into an absolutely perfect made trap. He's walked down here, marched down here, into the toe of Italy, into what was then called Brutium, and all Crassus has to do, and I say all and underline it massively there, is trap him and lock him in there and wait for him to starve.
The trap was truly monumental. What Crassus did was build a ditch and wall right across the toe of Italy to imprison the slave army. Defenses like these were the Roman army's stock in trade and had never been breached.
Crassus' position is incredibly strong. His army have constructed a magnificent fortification across this isthmus, so he is in a very strong position, and he probably thinks that this is impregnable, that Spartacus will come up and will probably attack it, but will beat himself to pieces on it, just as the waves do on the rocks.
In his first assault on the wall, Spartacus was thrown back. 6,000 of his men were killed. But his bloody-mindedness matched that of Crassus. He determined to show his own army the price of failure. The Roman punishment for rebellious slaves was crucifixion. It was a slow, painful, and humiliating death. Now Spartacus took a Roman prisoner, and in full view of both armies, had him nailed to the cross. In Rome, the Senate finally lost patience. Enough was enough. It was time to finish this slave revolt, to call back the armies from their wars of conquest abroad under their renowned generals Pompey and Lucullus. A new and dangerous endgame became apparent. For Spartacus, that he could be crushed where he sat. For Crassus, that his triumph might be snatched by his rivals. Spartacus decided to try a deal, to offer Crassus victory in exchange for the lives of his followers.
Crassus wants all the glory of victory. Crassus wants to engage. So Spartacus tries to make a deal, tries to enter a plea, to bargain. But of course it's refused, because how can a Roman make a bargain with a slave?
But the slave had one more lesson for the Roman. Under cover of night, he overwhelmed the supposedly impregnable fortifications and, for the last time, broke free.
This was an incredible achievement. Spartacus has carried out an unheard of military feat. He's on his way north again.
But at the point of his greatest triumph, Spartacus had run out of options. To his followers, he seemed invincible, a gladiator who had made the whole of Italy his arena. But even the largest arena offered only one choice: to fight or die. Hemmed in by 3 Roman armies, his fate was sealed. Once more, his troops clamored for Roman blood. Once more, it made them reckless. Once more, German slaves arrogantly demanded they fight separately, and were promptly slaughtered by Crassus. 35,000 were killed. Spartacus was now outnumbered by the Romans. But his followers were undeterred. They demanded that he lead them into battle again. They'd had 9 straight victories over their Roman masters. They'd twice marched the length of Italy. The higher the odds, the more they wanted battle, and once more, Spartacus was captive to their wishes.
This is a battle he has not sought, he does not want. But unfortunately, they are intoxicated by success. They feel they are supermen. This man, Spartacus, has led them to superhuman achievements, and they frankly overrule him.
This is the valley of the river Silarus, site of the final resistance of the slaves. It was the battle that Crassus desperately needed to claim the triumph as his own. For Spartacus there were no illusions, but as he threw in his lot with his men, one final piece of theatre.
Spartacus calls for his horse, and in front of his entire army kills it, saying to his army, if we win, I will have no need of this horse because we will have thousands of Roman horses. And if we lose, I will have no use of a horse anyway. In other words, publicly stating to his men that your fate is my fate.
The detail of the battle is stark. It was bitterly contested, with the slaves butchered in crowds. Spartacus stood his ground, even when his men fled. Struggling to get to Crassus, he killed 2 centurions outright, but was finally hacked down, still fighting.
Here was one of the most outstanding commanders of the ancient world, a man who came from absolutely the very bottom and the lowest dregs of the gutter, rose up, built an army from scratch without any assistance virtually at all, and took on the world's finest army and held it at bay for 2 years.
The Romans recovered the trophies taken by Spartacus in his 2-year struggle. 5 legionary eagles, 26 standards, each representing victory for him, humiliation for them. They recovered the fasces, and with it, the authority of Rome. But, we're told, what they didn't find on the battlefield was the body of Spartacus.
The image of the missing body is part of the myth creation of a legendary figure. Spartacus is both reality, a rebellious general slave who is miraculously effective as a leader of slaves, of gladiators, of peasants. But also he's a symbol of barbarian strength, a warning of what might happen to Rome. In the end, if we're not careful, the people whom we defeated will defeat us. And of course it happened. It took 4 centuries, but it happened.
Spartacus is a legend of the Romans' own making. It was they, the slave masters, who set down the history of his slave revolt, and they, the victors, who assured the enduring memory of his defeat. For the Romans, he was a bogeyman. What they couldn't anticipate was that for us, Spartacus would become a hero and the ultimate symbol of resistance to Rome. But it was the Roman response after the final battle that sealed the memory of his slave uprising. Denied the body of Spartacus, Crassus took the surviving rebels back to Capua, where the revolt had started. And from there, along the Appian Way to the gates of Rome, he crucified all 6,000 of them.
This was really the Roman equivalent of the M4 or the M1. Hundreds of people would be travelling up and down this road every day. And after all, not only were they going to see 6,000 bodies between here and the capital, they would see those 6,000 bodies for the next 3 months, because the bodies were not taken down and buried. They were just allowed to rot and finally disintegrated. This is, yes, the end of an extraordinary, but ultimately a story riddled with pathos and sadness at the end of the day.
Spartacus' achievement must be that we're still talking about him. is part of the story of human hope, of human effort, of trying against all the odds to succeed. And he's an image that a brave man can put up a good fight in adverse circumstances.